Hi, Mandibil here. I recently made a comment on a 2 hour and 10 minutes long debate between Stefan Molyneux and Rationality Rules, where they discuss or apparently should discuss universally preferable behavior, a proof of secular ethics by Stefan Molyneux, which Rationality Rules has criticized in a few videos during the last couple of years. And finally, they meet on Stefan Molyneux's channel. He has, as far as I can understand, invited Rationality Rules to join him in a debate, rather than keep going back and forth with these slightly pathetic videos, in my opinion. But that's my opinion. What happened then is they went through the debate and finished it, and Stefan Molyneux and Rationality Rules uploaded each on their channel and linking on Facebook and Twitter and so on, I presume, the raw interview or debate. And then a couple of days later, or maybe the day after, I'm not sure, but sometime later, Stefan Molyneux uploaded a new HD high definition version, or that's in the title, where he has actually added some of his own post-production comments to his viewers. So he says he's trying to clarify something about the debate that probably didn't go as planned or something like that. And first of all, I find that highly critical, highly, what's the word? It needs to receive a very good deal of criticism, because for many reasons. But first of all, you don't change if you have made an agreement or something, and you sort of it's baked in the cake that whatever result is recorded is what is put out, unaltered and unchanged and not cut up or anything like that. And that means, implicitly in any kind of contract, unless it was stated beforehand that yes, when we are done with this interview or debate, I'm going to inject something if I think I want that. If that was a part of the agreement, well, then fine. But from what I have read from Rationality Rules and comments far and wide, that was not the case, right? So you are breaking your agreement with Rationality Rules by injecting extra explanations or extra slides or extra extra clarifications about what you want to tell. And because during this process of debating, you didn't accept Rationality Rules critiques of specific arguments which he found fallacious. You had to have be guided beforehand that he was going to that, and with references to the context and the specific statement in the book or whatever. But you are doing exactly that without him having anything to do about it, right? He can't do anything about what you do with the debate between him and you. You didn't advise him beforehand before you did it. So you are completely hypocritical about how you go about debating with people. It's really ugly, in my opinion. This is that I've been following. I have been following you, Stefan Molyneux, for almost 10 years, and you, not to deify you in any way, but you were the reason I started to philosophize. So now I'm feeling a bit like Aristotle who has to go and make his own academy because Plato is going completely out of his rails. And at this point, I have decided I'm going to treat Stefan Molyneux as a manipulative sophist. I'm going to, in any possible debate or any possible situation where I can argue about UPB, I'm going to try to take it apart, right? I'm doing everything I can to take UPB apart because I no longer believe it has any validity at all. Everything points in the direction that this doesn't work. And Stefan Molyneux needs to grab his own titties and say, okay, it's so convoluted now. It's so convoluted that I cannot even argue with somebody trying to having a decent debate with me whether or not it is correct. This is absolutely unbelievable. And he calls himself a philosopher. If he wants to still call himself a philosopher, he needs to say, okay, UPB does not work. I need to go back to the drawing board and I need to fix this. Or I have to make the statement that I don't have a moral principle. I don't have, he didn't even have that with the UPB. I don't even have a technique for validating moral principles. I have to, at some point, he needs to say, okay, it doesn't work. I have the amount of critique and the amount of, dodging and, oh, no, it's an ambush, about his own book. It's so ridiculous now. It's absolutely ridiculous. And it's going to be your downfall if you don't correct this. You need to grab it and say, okay, there's a line in the sand here. I'm going to take my book back. I'm going to refute what I have said that I thought it was valid. It's no longer valid. I'm going to take the book off the shelves. I'm going to either say I cannot find any technique to find moral principles, or you're going to say, I'm going to make a new book that is better than this. I'm going to argue in another way, in another fashion, to make sure that I make something that works. Maybe the problem is that the only thing he has is this argument that if you argue against UPB, you are doing UPB. This is all he has. And just like Rationality Rules says, it is a hypothetical imperative. It's not an ought. There's no ought there, right? If there's an ought, it's something that Stefan has put in. It's not an ought in itself because you're not observing anything. You're just manipulating words into, all of a sudden there's an ought here, right? It just appears out of nowhere because Stefan wants it to be that way, because he needs to bridge Hume's is-ought gap, and he does it in this fashion, or he attempts to do it, and it's faulty. So, but I'm going to, because I made a reaction of the whole of the other video, I feel obliged to take a new stab at the part where, or that part where Stefan has added new stuff, in order to clarify, maybe because otherwise the other thing I did might not be completely suitable. So I need to, rehash this a bit in order to accommodate this new addition. And I rewound a bit, 10 minutes or something like that. Let me just check here. Something like 5 to 10 minutes before he interjects a new slide and comments on it, to get in the context of what they were talking about. So let's get going.
So if somebody genuinely believes that language has no meaning, they will not debate me.
Sure.
We accept that, right? So debating,
you.
Sorry. Well, no, they themselves will not debate me.
It wouldn't make sense, yeah.
Right. So by debating, the if is done.
No, it isn't. Yeah, the if is done, but then there must have been an if, right? You don't have to express it in a verbal argument for there to be an argument. You can, if you are mute or blind and nothing works, you can still argue, but you're just arguing within yourself. It's part of rationality. You argue with yourself to figure out what you're going to do, right? They are all if clauses. Everything you think before you act are based on ifs, right? They are depending on some sort of scientific or whatever you want to call it, judgment of happens in the past compared to what is now, and trying to predict the outcome of some action in the future. So if this happened in the past and this is the case now, then this should happen. That's what you're doing when you are existing and behaving, whatever you want to call it, right? So it's always based on an if clause. Everything you do is based on an if clause. The point of morality is it is exactly the opposite. It's counter rationality. Morality is irrational because it goes against your rationality. Because you need to, if your rationality says, I need to get that ice cream, and you pull it out of the hand of another person, then there's nothing in your rationality that says you shouldn't grab the ice cream. It's when the moral principle, the guidance of the moral principle is applied to the situation which makes it counter-rational, because you wanted that ice cream, that was rational for you, but you are not going to act upon that if clause because you have a moral principle, right? You can't just pull that moral principle into that if clause in yourself. That is what Hume says you can't do. And he says, if you're going to I'm correcting myself, if you want to do that, you need to explain how you do it. You can't just pull it into, okay, so now you took a decision and used your mouth in this way and made these sounds. This means you have used an ought. No, you haven't. There's no ought in it. And rationality rules is absolutely right. He sticks to Hume's guillotine, which is, of course, what you should do when you are validating moral principles. But saying that people, because they do this particular sound with their mouth, then they have applied an ought, is ridiculous, right? You just need to decompose the arguments and see what are they based on. What are we just throwing around words, and then it just starts to sound like we are using an ought while we are actually not using an ought. This is what all these vulgar kinds of morality and ethics that Hume is referring to. These bridging the gap without a bridge. It's not there. Stefan hasn't pointed to it. Absolutely not. Because it's not something you describe by describing what people do. You can't point to something and say, aha, there's ought. Ought is something you create, you define that ought, right? It's a definition of what should be compared to what is. How do you make that definition? You can't just say there's an ought there, right? You have to establish the bridge, and it hasn't been done using that argument.
Okay, so if language has meaning, then you can debate, right?
Okay, so let me tell you where I think that if it...
Language doesn't have meaning. I think I was on this in the last podcast, and maybe don't need to go too deep into that, but the meaning is created in your head. Language is created in your head. The meaning is the language. Language is meaning of sounds that create meaning in your head. That is language. Language is just another word for meaning. There's no meaning in the words. It's when the sound enters your mind, it initiates meaning. It initiates concepts, but it's not the sound itself that has that context. It doesn't have meaning in itself. The meaning is created by you.
And you correct me where you would put it. Okay, I would say if I want to be accurate about UPB, I ought to debate Stefan Molyneux.
No. Let's stick with the language thing. That's way down the field. That's way down the field.
That's the only reason I'm having a debate. It's all predicated on if clauses.
No. We were just right there. We were just right there to solve the issue, right? So let's just stay where we were.
We were just right there. No. Shut up. I know where it is. Shut up with your comments. I know what's right and wrong. I said it down. Why don't you understand it?
Just being really productive, if you don't mind, just for a sec. So the if is by engaging in debate, you accept that language has meaning. So if you...
No, I'm not accepting language has meaning. I am saying in myself before I utter myself. If what I'm going to say has meaning, it is going to ignite specific emotions and concepts and whatever it ignites in another person, right? But the argument can be inside yourself. It doesn't have to be expressed. That's it's
debate. You must accept that language has meaning, because if you don't accept that language has meaning, you won't debate. The very act of debating solves the if. It's embedded in the act of debating.
Yeah, there's an if. It's based on an if, but the if was still there. You didn't express the if. You don't say, if this works, then I'm going to, right? You are building what you're doing on an if statement, a hypothetical imperative, to quote Kant, inside yourself, and then you're talking or communicating, right? But the if was still there. Just because he didn't express it doesn't mean that it wasn't there, right? He's trying to say that the ought is built into what you do because you didn't express it. So because you didn't say if then else, or if then maybe, it's sort of an ought that because you didn't express the if then it's an ought. That no work made.
So we're going to have to spell this out a little further. So
no, that's good. This is the whole thing, right?
When I say I'm going to debate you, one of the premises, of course, is that language has meaning. I'm either convinced of that proposition or I'm not, and it's necessary that I'm convinced of that proposition to engage you.
Yes,
I agree with you. I need to accept that, and then I can say, if I want to be accurate about UPB, I ought to have a conversation, and it's predicated on the fact that I accept that you exist, I accept the language, etc. That there is no should here. The only shoulds we have are hypothetical, and it's in me. It's not universal. It's just me.
Yeah,
I know.
that's what
I get.
said
Look,
before.
I get that. I mean, universal. There are no universals that exist outside of the human mind. I get all of that, right? There's no morality that exists outside of a relationship that we have with each other. There's no scientific method described in the nature of atoms. There's no physical laws in the universe that are written down anywhere except in a book written by human beings. So I get our concepts, our ideas. They don't exist out there in the real world. I get all of that. And if that's where Hume's at, and you can't get these shoulds from the is. I get all of that, right? And that's why I say it's in the act of debating and correcting someone that you're accepting UPB. And so and you've already got one, right? Language has meaning. Now, language has meaning
But then UPB is an if clause. It's a hypothetical. It's still an hypothetical. It's if you want to debate, you need to do this. There's no ought in it. You're just calling it an ought, right? There's nothing. There's no particular action you should take. There's no necessary connection between what you want and what you should do. There are no necessary connections. Usually it works when you use a particular language that another individual understands. That if you want to make yourself understood, it's preferable to use you would probably consider it preferable. I would consider it preferable to use that kind of language. But there's no ought that you should use that language, right? You can evaluate all you want whether or not you should use a language. There's nothing in it that creates an ought that you ought to use it, right? It's not, yes, I want to communicate with that guy, but that doesn't mean I should communicate with that guy. Maybe I want to, but that doesn't mean I should do it, right? Is that bridging from there's no necessary connection that this must lead to this? And there are no situations where that is the case. There's nothing that ought to happen after an incentive to do something. There's nothing that must happen, right? There's no, okay, if you want this, you must do it this way. And there are two problems with that. First of all, you don't have to do anything, even if you want to do something. There's nobody who says you must do something. And there's no one particular thing you must do. It doesn't follow from what you want to do, right? Even if you say, if I need to do this, then I must do that. But it doesn't mean you have to do it, right? And it's all about judging actions and their consequences that morality and virtue and these things are about, right? So it's at least it's too complicated for people to use as an argument for. I mean, if you're going to use UPB, first of all, it's a validation of moral principles. So first of all, you need a moral principle in order to use UPB. So if you use somebody else's or your own moral principle, you have to sift it through UPB before you can use it. Okay, so if you find no problem with it using UPB, okay, I guess you can go ahead and use it according to Stefan Molyneux. I think it's very badly argued. The way it's argued, it's a negative or an indirect proof, which is not a solid proof, at least not in philosophy. But it's too complicated to be so. When it's so fluffy, whether or not we are dealing with an ought or we are not dealing with an ought. If it's fluffy, you need to reject it, right? I mean, you need to be a good philosopher is a skeptical philosopher. anytime there's doubt about something, reject it and start all over, right? All these sort of fluffy ends that, okay, so we need to agree about this, we need to agree about this, and then it starts, this sounds like an ought, doesn't it sound like an ought? I think it's an ought, so I think we can go ahead and say, it's too fluffy. It's simply too fluffy. It can't work. It can never get to work. It has to be crystal clear what you're talking about. It should be clear to everyone, anyone trying to use UPB.
Doesn't exist in the universe. It's a concept, right? It's a relationship between you and language and someone that you're talking to. So it's like saying there's no such thing as marriage because marriage is not an umbilical cord that ties two people together, right? I mean, there's no such thing as a
No, a marriage is an agreement. A marriage is a contract. And the contract states clearly what is supposed to happen in that marriage. There's a third entity, there's the third object involved in that, and that is the marriage, the contract between these two, I suppose, two people, right?
Forest, because the forest is just a concept and the individual trees aren't bounded by a conceptual cloud called forest that you can measure with a spectrometer or something like that, right? So it is, the should or the ought is accepted in the very act of conversing.
No, it isn't, and I just argued for it before. It's not inherent in what you say. You made an if clause before you made your argument.
In other words, you accept that language has meaning when you engage in a debate.
Yeah,
and so if we accept that, that's the should. That's the ought. Language has meaning. That's the only way you get to debate, is to accept that. So you can't argue that language doesn't have meaning. That's already off the table.
I agree that you can't argue that language doesn't have meaning. What I'm disagreeing with is whether or not the should, as it were, is a categorical or a hypothetical, because it's hypothetical.
If you debate, right, that's the if. If you debate, you must accept that language has meaning. Now, you could say, well, what if you don't accept that? Doesn't matter. You're not debating. Like, you're not part of the conversation.
This is why I gave the first definition of objectively required, because if you say, if you want to debate, you must accept that language has meaning, that's just a description. That's why I gave a descriptive version of UPB, because you do that several times in your book.
I said must.
There's also another problem that occurred to me with language. When you are using language or words or sounds that you call language, you actually don't know if other people think or have meaning. You are taking the chance every time you do it because you don't experience what they experience. You could be talking, and for some reason, what you are talking about correlates to whatever action they're performing and the consequences they create. You can't have knowledge about meaning in somebody else's mind. You only have meaning in your own mind. When you utter a word like polar bear and you ignite the concept polar bear in your mind by uttering that word, you actually don't even need to utter the word. That's another point. But the only meaning that you have access to is your own meaning. There might be some actions or responses or whatever you want to call it that occur after you have expressed your language, but that is not the same as they are injected or implied sort of proofs that the language works, but you don't have access to any other individual's creation of understanding of language or meaning of language. You only have access to your own meaning. So every time you express yourself, you're just taking it for granted that that meaning that you have is also present in other individuals, but you actually don't have that knowledge. You will never have that knowledge. You're just taking the chance that it works every time. So you're not accepting meaning, right? Nobody has, well, maybe from your parents has created that meaning in yourself, but as I said, you only have access to your own meaning of words. You can't access other people's meaning. So you can't say there's an objective standard for meaning of language. It's impossible to make an objective standard. So you are referring to a meaning that only you have access to directly. You are inferring that meaning onto other people, but that is not the same as saying that they are following an objective standard, because that meaning is only within individuals. So
the word must is a synonym for ought.
If you say must, then it is a synonym of short.
You said must.
And in which case you're doing a hypothetical imperative. You're saying,
you said so. If you want to debate, you must accept that language has meaning. There's your ought right there. To debate, you ought to accept that language has meaning.
Okay, so the word must can be described as...
Now he is smuggling the word ought into an if clause and says, now I prove that oughts exist. And because I can prove one ought, I can throw around oughts as I please, right?
Is as a prerequisite, it's necessary. It's just a factual statement, or it could be a should. I can give you
no must. There's no must There's no must that exists in the universe.
No, I didn't say must exist in the universe. What I'm saying is, if you say something must happen, or if you're going to say for A to happen, B must happen, you can use that as a description in the sense if you're just describing that it's necessary, it's a prerequisite, which is the first definition that I mentioned that you've rejected. That's fair play. But if you use must as a synonym of should, then you're just, because of your if clause, it's just a hypothetical imperative.
It is a hypothetical. Yeah, I get all of that. And that's why I say, that's why I said what premises are implicitly accepted when debating. You have to engage and enter into the act of debating in order for these shoulds, these musts to manifest. And if you're not engaged in the act of debating, then you don't have to watch.
It's not a should or a must that manifest. As I pointed out earlier, there are no shoulds and oughts. You're confusing sort of science with oughts. If I make this sound, I am going to, maybe it's not even, it's a bad way to compare it to science, but if I want to ignite a specific concept in another person's mind, I believe that I am going to have to, right? I need to utter this sound but it doesn't mean that I ought to in a moral sense. It's not an ought because I can refrain from expressing myself, but an ought is not something I can refrain from. If there's an ought, I must do it. That's a sort of a kind of a demand, right? It's something different than if I want to, ride my bicycle, I need to jump on my bicycle and push the pedals, right? But it doesn't mean I have to go ride the bicycle, right? I don't have to express myself in a language. The ought is that sort of commandment that says, if this is the case, you must act in a certain way, or you must refrain from acting in a certain way. That's the difference, and I believe that that's the difference that Immanuel Kant was referring to, right? Separating hypothetical and categorical imperatives. So the categorical part, I disagree with Kant's interpretation of these categories. It's not a category of action in itself that is the problem, but that's a discussion for another day. So let's head on.
Or if you're not correcting anyone, if you're not telling anyone that they're wrong, if you're not engaged in the act of polishing the sword of human thought or anything like that, fine. If you're napping, you're not debating, and though you don't have to figure out whether language has meaning, because you can have a bafflegab combination of Klingon and Hobbit in your dreams, and who cares, right? So it's the moment you step into a correction-based conversation with another human being, boom, all of those ifs and oughts are satisfied. At least the ones we've started talking about, that other people exist, objective reality exists, the senses have validity, and so on.
You don't even have access to the ifs in another person. You only have access to your own ifs. You don't know if they have an if, right? You can't make that backward necessary connection then, because you acted this way, there was this if inside you. You don't know what ifs are in people, right? So you are jumping, it's sort of, you're jumping across this this gap with this bridge from ought to is and is to ought, and just as you see fit, and you have to explain how you do it. You can't just do it and say, now I did it, right?
So on. Those are all accepted. All of those are accepted. They don't exist in the universe, but they exist in you participating in the act of debating.
I guess to wrap up on this part for now, if you're up for it, and I'll give you the last word on this part. Basically, there's other balls that I want to throw at you, and I don't want to bore the audience with us getting too far bogged into just disagreeing. When I debate with you, I assume lots of things that are contradictory can't be true. So I assume that language has meaning. I assume that reality exists, that you and I inhabit reality, that you and I have a conversation, that, you know, language is a useful thing for meaning. I assume all of these things. All of these things are describing facts that are prerequisites, that are necessary for us to have the conversation. But the only way I can say that I ought to have a conversation with you is if I have the categorical imperative of saying, if I want to be accurate about UPB, which I do want to be, I ought to have a conversation with Stefan. What I would say, and what I would try and stress to the audience, that this is not the holy grail of philosophy. It's either just describing what's necessary in order to have a debate, or it's Kant's hypothetical imperative.
I would say that both Rationality Rules and Stefan Molyneux is equivocating the term ought. Ought is a sort of a weasel word. It's not. It comes all the way back from Hume, of course, but it needs to be clarified what we are talking about when we are saying ought, because if you are mixing ought into hypothetical statements, it gets so confused that nobody can any longer figure out when something is ought and when it's not an ought, right? Or when we are talking about morality, moral statements, and when we are talking about statements that does not have a moral content, right? So if I want to eat an ice cream, I ought to get an ice cream. I mean, yeah, it sounds like you are, but the ought is referring to Hume's is-ought gap. And that is about morality. That cannot be, that we must agree about on that. So when he's using ought or is, he is comparing moral statements to statements that does not have a moral content. So using an ought in a hypothetical statement is making it even more ridiculously convoluted and misinterpretable. So nobody has any longer any clue what the hell we're talking about.
Imperative. But I'll give you the last word on this before we move on. Thanks everyone so far for listening, by the way.
No, I don't have a last word on that. I mean, as long as we accept that there are a whole bunch of things that we need to conform to in order to have a debate, yeah, that's UPB right there. Now, let's get... No, I know you say that you don't, but that's fine. I mean, this will come in a little bit later. Now, is there another topic that you wanted to get to? Because I have my list.
Yeah, I do have.
I have my list. I'm going to get him. I'm going to ambush him.
Another criticism that I think will be good. I'm not 100% on this one, so it would be definitely good to hear your view on it, as it were. And yeah, if you'd like me to, I'll just get straight to the second ball, as it were. You can consider that the first one. This would be the second.
Yeah, go for it.
Thanks, man. So either you or I should define what begging the question is. Would you like me to do it yourself? I'm cool with whatever. Sure. So begging the question occurs when somebody when the conclusion of an argument, begging the question occurs when the premise of an argument is the conclusion. So if I wanted to prove to you, for instance, that the Earth is spherical, and I said, look, premise one, the Earth is spherical, I beg the question, like, it's game over. It doesn't matter that the Earth is actually spherical. It is still begging the question.
It's like going into a courtroom and saying, okay, let's assume the guy is guilty and then have a trial. It's like, no, that's what you've got to establish, right? Okay.
That's it, man. So one of the most famous examples is presuppositional apologetics. I don't know if any of you, or yourself, or anyone in the audience has had the pain of having to debate a presuppositional apologist, but their argument essentially goes as follows, and they're trying to prove God. They say, look, premise one, logic and argumentation presupposes God. Premise two, arguing against the validity of God demonstrates God. Conclusion, therefore, no argument against God can be valid. It's begging the question because since their goal is to prove the existence of God.
I might add from Wikipedia, the definition of begging the question is to beg the question is to put forward an argument whose validity requires that its own conclusion to be true. So it's not that the premises are necessarily a part of the conclusion. It's rather that the premises already needs the conclusion to be true or correct or valid. So the premises are dependent on the truth of the proposition. And that is invalid because that is what you're trying to establish. So you can first claim that something is true and then proving that it's true on the foundation that you have so it's completely ridiculous, right? So this is to clarify what is meant with begging the question.
Their first premise can't be logic and argumentation presupposes God, because it's basically, it's not even basically, it's just straight up including its conclusion in any kind of interaction. And this brings me to your first proof of UPB, which you give on page 40. You say, premise one, the proposition is the concept universally preferable behavior must be valid.
Hey everybody, it's Steph. I'm sorry to elbow in. I'll make this really...
He just cuts directly into, he doesn't even give him time to express his statement that he made in the previous video. Just, you know, I'm the god here. I have to go in and tell my acolytes, my followers, my cult following, what they should think. It's very, very distasteful. It's dishonest philosophy and dishonest debating and dishonest. I mean, I can't believe he's doing this, to be quite frank. I mean, he's kind of sliding himself into, I don't know what the hell is wrong. There's something that is not right with Stefan Molyneux, and it has been going on for a couple of years, at least a couple of years, but maybe like 4 years or something like that. There's something that is wrong. That is something that rubs me the wrong way. He doesn't take, he's so invested in this UPB that he's not going to listen to anybody. And this one trick pony he has, that if you're trying to debate UPB, you are proving UPB, means he can't debate anybody. So he's locked himself in a true only chamber where everybody knocking and say, I want to discuss with you. No, but you're trying to discuss, then you're proving my statement. So he can never get anyone to challenge him, right? And also he needs to be a true philosopher and be the biggest philosophy show in the world and all that stuff. He needs to have some kind of morality and ethics somewhere that he can refer to, because otherwise he wouldn't be able to make any moral statements at all, because then people would say, well, what are you referring to when you're making moral statement? Where is the ought, right? So he has to have something. So he is so invested in his UPB that he actually really no longer care whether it works or not. To him, it's more important that he has an agenda, that he needs to be the Jesus of philosophy, rather than examining whether or not it's actually correct what he's saying, right? He's become a bad, agenda-driven sophist rather than a philosopher, in my opinion.
Really brief, because this next section got people a little upset, baffled, bewildered, and so on. So I want to sort of clear it up. So,
I want to clear it up. God enters and, tells people what they should think. They can't think for themselves. My little peons, my little fan base, they can't. They might get the wrong idea of how important and how good a philosopher I am. So I need to tell them what they should think. They can't think for themselves. I need to go intervene, like philosophical divine intervention, and tell people what they should think about this.
Steve says to me that I, Steph, am committing the logical fallacy called begging the question, which is to assume that what's being debated is already true. It's like starting a trial with saying, okay, let's assume that the person is guilty, right? So that's not valid. So this is from a section of the book. I'll link to it below. It's called 5 Supports. So back in the day, it was called 5 Proofs. I think 5 Supports is a more accurate term. And so what he did.
Proofs and supports. So has the term, the importance of the statements, has it changed? Because now you're calling it something else. I understand it's a good idea to clarify and optimize and so on. But if they are central to your arguments, so they're no longer proofs, now they are just supports. What does that mean? So can I trust it now? If it's just a support, is it no longer very good? Is it not something I can, trust to be universal? What's the problem?
Is I come up with a whole bunch of arguments for the validity and soundness of universally preferable behavior. And one of them starts off, the proposition is the concept universally preferable behavior must be valid. Now, if that's all I ever said, I said, the way that I...
Well, first of all, it's not a proposition, because there's nothing you are proposing. You are not referring to anything that can be observed. You can observe universality, you can observe preferability, you can observe behavior, right? These are all mental constructs, as you have yourself pointed out. So it cannot be proposed because it doesn't exist in your reality, right? So the proposition is, must be valid. A proposition that something must be valid is not a proposition, right? This whole sentence is complete nonsense. It's complete freaking nonsense.
Establish UPB is to say
a proposition can only be true or false. That's what propositions are. Is this a banana? True or false, right? It's only concepts that can be true or false. Only things that can be true or false can be propositions. Otherwise, they are some other kind of statement. They are not propositions. Proposition can't be valid. It can be nonsensical. What you are saying and claiming as a proposition is actually not a proposition, but you are saying it's a proposition. So if you're claiming it's a proposition, it can't be valid. It must be true or false, right? Are you saying it's true by saying it's valid? So you're confusing all these terms into a big mess.
that it must be valid, then that would be begging the question. And this is the sentence that he says is begging the question. However, it is in a chapter called 5 Supports or 5 Proofs. And I go on with a whole bunch of syllogisms, and you can read this in the book. And so there's supports for it. And then, of course, the central argument is that from here, that you can't argue against, right? If I argue against the proposition that universally preferable behavior is valid, I've already shown my preference for truth over falsehood, as well as a preference for correcting those who speak falsely, according to objective standards. I say here, saying that there is no such thing as universally preferable behavior is like shouting in someone's ear that sound does not exist. It is innately self-contradictory.
He said to Rationality Rules, I will not go into this thing about this sentence in my book and digging it out, because I don't have it in front of me, and it could be it's a boring way of ambushing me and so on. And then he injects it himself, and he said, well, we can do another podcast or debate, and then we can prepare, and then he does exactly the opposite. He injects it himself after the fact, after he said it's a boring thing, and then he injects it himself. What are you doing, man? It's freaking ridiculous.
So the way that I argue this is, okay, the proposition is the concept universally preferable behavior must be valid. But then if you argue against that, you're demonstrating universally preferable behavior, therefore no argument against the validity of universally preferable behavior can be valid. Now, you can argue this, of course, right? And certainly people have, but he just took this sentence fragment, the concept universally preferable behavior must be valid, and say, aha, you're assuming it's true, and you're begging the question, and that's, it's just not even true. It's not even close to true. It's a bit of a smear, dishonest tactic and all of that. And so the reason that I didn't dive into it, just so you know this from a sort of combat standpoint when it comes to fighting for the truth, the reason that I didn't delve into it during the debate was, if you say you're begging the question, then you say to someone, so Steve is saying to me that I, Steph, have made a claim in a very lengthy book that has no supporting evidence, right? And so if I then...
No, he's trying to point out that there might be some begging the question thing going on in how you argue, and I certainly support that claim. It sounds very, very much like you are trying to begging the question. And if you're not trying to begging the question, you should back up and say, this is a very bad way of arguing. If anybody says this feels a bit like, right? It seems a bit like bad arguing this. You're using the wrong term. You're using valid instead of true and false for propositions. And it's all a big mess. But instead of saying, okay, this must be reformulated so people understand what I'm saying, he's just saying, I'm trying to be ambushed. I'm okay. It's my book. Yes, it's my book. You can't criticize my book because it's true. It's so true.
And say, okay, let's dive into this. And I then have to find some way to rapidly scan through the entire book and make sure that I never made an argument to support the proposition. And you can't do that on the fly. You just can't grind your way through a long book in the middle of a live debate. And that's why I said you need to tell me about...
He didn't want to grind through a long book. It's so dishonest way of arguing. Right? You are framing what he says to something he didn't say. He specifically went for these statements. You have numbered the statements, statement 1, statement 2, statement 3. It's to focus people's eyes on these exact statements. And then you're saying, oh, no, it's contextual. It's about the context of the whole book. So I can't stand in front of my mirror and with my toothbrush and run through your freaking whole book to figure out whether or not I should brush my teeth, right? If it's universal, a statement is universal. It is not contextual, right? It can't be the whole context of your book that has to be understood in order to understand your universal statement. Man.
This ahead of time, because it's one of these odd things. If it's a self-contained syllogism, then you can argue its merits just based upon what's there. If it's an argument someone is making live, sure. But if you're trying to say to someone, hey man, there's no needle in this haystack, and you said there was a needle in this haystack, it's like, okay, well, I got to go find the needle in the haystack, which I can do.
So your book is a haystack. Finding any argument in your freaking book is like looking for a needle in a haystack. Okay, you just said that your book is a piece of shite, right? It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. Nobody can use what you have written to anything. It's completely useless. It's a big pile of words equivocating left and right, and fallacies. Standing in queue to trying to convince you that you are, creating an odd out of a sound by somebody makes with their mouth. I mean, it's completely ridiculous.
Of course, but I can't do that during a live debate. So when somebody says to you that you're begging the question, that in a long book you've made an assertion without any supporting evidence or arguments, they need to tell you that ahead of time, because maybe it's 10 pages away, maybe it's at the beginning, maybe it's in a footnote. It could be any number of things, but you can't try and find supporting arguments for the assertion or the alleging of begging the question. You can't do that in a live debate. And I said, listen, let's, email.
You invited him. You invited him to come and discuss UPB. You didn't invite him to come and discuss his videos about Jordan Peterson, or his videos about something where he might have made a logical error or had contradicted himself about his odd claims and such. It's specifically about UPB and fallacies within UPB. That is all that the Rationality Rules has focused on, right? And exactly that is what you are not going to allow him to do. What kind of ridiculous person are you? You are inviting people to come and discuss something, and then you say, no, I'm not going to discuss that. No, it's a big book. It's a big haystack, and I can't find the needle. Holy...
Email me and we'll go further into it, but he kept pestering me on it. So of course it gets kind of annoying, because when he said he didn't want to talk about libertarianism, I'm like, okay, fine, we'll just move on. So yeah, I just wanted to sort of jump in and say that, and just remember the link to the book will be below. It's well worth checking out. Like if you go to my site here, it's really available, and there is the zoom out a little here. So we've got the audiobook right there in high quality audio. We've got the video. If you wanted to follow along with the text and the video,
go and read my book.
Download.
It's so important that you inject this commercial for your book into sort of slapping Rationality Rules on the face and then injecting a commercial into the debate. Holy crap, man. What are you thinking? Where are your manners? It's unbelievable. You have slid into something completely ridiculous that is so far from philosophy or any decent kind of behavior when you're debating and arguing, and you have cornered yourself into this little box where you say, everybody else is wrong, I'm right. Everybody else is wrong, I'm right. Everybody else is wrong. Oh, man.
The ebook, and all of these are free, right? Audiobook, the text, this.
I might add that I am starting to feel like this Free Domain and Stefan Molyneux, Free Domain Radio, and the following, it has become a cult. Because it's not long ago, before this Rationality Rules, Rationality Rules debate, I was contacted by some guy from, I guess, from some inner circle or some part of the discussion behind the scenes with Free Domain and Stefan Molyneux, who had seen some of my critique videos about UPB, and he asked me to join a discussion after this live transmission of the debate. And I first of all, I said, no, I don't want to participate in that. But then I said, well, why not? Well, let's maybe it could be good fun, right? Maybe I could learn something about what's going on behind the curtain, right? But first of all, I had to make a month subscription to the channel. Like, okay, then I showed $3, right? He didn't say that, okay, if you want to join, you need to. He just said, why don't you come and join? I thought it was free, right? So, okay, I paid the $3 and then I joined, but then there was some problem with the Discord channel, and I had an old account and a new account, and it got mixed up, and so there was some problems. But then we started to talk on Messenger back and forth, and I started to argue with him and extend my criticism of both, we talk about general philosophy and morality, and then with regards to UPB and Stefan and what he has said through the years and so on. And it was pretty clear to me that this guy was actually out on a mission to get new members into the inner circle, or sort of. When I started to, get firm in my argumentation with him, he just kept pulling back, like, no, I'm just trying to, no, I'm just don't ask me. And he was some guy from Australia with studying philosophy and psychology and all sorts of that. He was a free market guy, but he was living off the backs of the poor, studying philosophy in Australia, right? Why is he running around trying to Shanghai people into the fold, right? I'm not doing that, right? So there's a tendency for Stefan Molyneux to catch people who want a father figure or some sort of Socrates figure or something that they can hang their philosophy on, right? And then they invest themselves in him as a person. Even though Stefan Molyneux has said several times, I'm just some guy on the internet. I'm just some guy from Canada or whatever, right? But he is specifically in this video interjecting this message. He is trying to make sure that his disciples have the correct understanding, or they are not misinterpreting how his teachings should be understood, right? It has all the cultish flavor you need in order to say back away, okay, I'm not going in on this one, right?
This text on the website, all free, but you can buy it if you want a hard copy as well. All right, so let's just get back to the debate, which I really appreciated, and I just want to jump in and tell you this.
Yeah.
And this brings me to your first proof of UPB, which you give on page 40. You say, premise 1, the proposition is the concept universally preferable behavior must be valid. That is, to me, clearly begging the question, because if you are trying to prove that UPB exists and your first premise is universally preferable behavior must be valid, correct me where I'm going wrong, but that is clearly begging the question.
No, but I then provide a whole bunch of supporting arguments to that. It's not just a statement, right? I mean, there's a whole series of supporting arguments.
But you are specifically, as you showed before, you had pulled out these statements 1, 2, and 3, right? That means that they are specific. They must be more condensed. They must be more precise. They must be able to stand alone. You're not saying that this argument is dependent on that context and supplied that this is right and this is right, and that statement is dependent on that context. And because you haven't done that in the book, people reading the book might actually think that these statements are not dependent on context, because they are actually dealing with universality, right? So it's a big pile of BS.
For evidence towards UPB. So that's not begging the question at all. I'm saying, okay, let's get into evidence that supports the concepts of UPB.
Okay, so if I wanted to prove to you that the Earth is a sphere, and my first premise was the Earth is a sphere, and then you said to me, you're begging the question. And I said, no, because I give evidences elsewhere. My argument is still begging the question. Those arguments over there, which can be laid out in premises, may not be begging the question, but it's still begging the question. So I guess
No,
what I'm saying-
I'm not. I can't go with you there. I don't have the text in front of me, but I go through a lot of effort to establish the validity of UPB. So saying I just state it and that's begging the question. Come on. I mean, let's be fair about that.
No, so I don't. If I'm honest with you, I just don't think you understand begging the question. And I apologize.
That's a sort of a. That's a claim he cannot back up because he can't know how. I know how he feels, but I don't think the problem is that he don't know begging the question, because he clearly does. But he wants to avoid him arguing against any of the arguments he put forth, any statements, or try to find any kind of fallacy within UPB statements. He just wants to wipe him off and then get back to attacking him instead, right?
Well, no, I don't have the text in front of me, so I mean, I don't know what context you're quoting in.
Why don't you have your text in front of you? Isn't it UPB, right? You don't even, I mean, if you don't have the text in front of you, but you are discussing UPB, and you have your text in front of you in order to discuss UPB, why don't you have your text in front of you when you're debating UPB? It's ridiculous. It's an insult to the one you're debating with. You're asking him to take 2 hours off of his life, plan some debate on a Sunday, and maybe he's tired after a long weekend or sitting there at 10 or 11 p.m. and discussing with you, and then you're saying, no, I don't care about your. How dare you, man?
It doesn't. A syllogism doesn't need context if it's guilty of certain logical fallacies.
No, because if I say UPB is valid, and then I say here's all the arguments why, and you say, well, you're saying UPB is valid, and that's back. Let's not do this part. This part is, I think, beneath both of us. Let's see if we can get on. Because you got to tell me, if you want to start quoting my book, then you got to give me the quote ahead of time so that I can see the context of what it is.
So you need something ahead of time. Did you advise Rationality Rules on the list you're going to attack and ambush him with? Did you advise him on that beforehand?
Is you're just pulling one sentence out and saying that's begging the question. That's boring for the audience. And, email me and I'll sort of provide something else, but I can't sort of pull up the text and see what else is around there and all that kind of stuff. So I don't have the context for that. Now, let's get to, if that's all right.
Please.
Sorry?
Because this is critically important.
Yes.
Well, if it was so critically important, why wouldn't you send it to me beforehand so I could have a chance to review the text that you're quoting?
That's not a valid argument.
Come on, this is an ambush, right?
It's important.
Okay, my first video reply to you, the first criticism I gave you was off your first proof, because I assume it's your favorite proof because you put it first. May not be true, it doesn't matter. But I gave you this clearly, and when you reviewed my video, you literally
That's like a year and a half ago, man. Come on. I mean, let's deal with what we can debate in the here and now, rather than trying to quote pull from a book from years ago, from a rebuttal you did from years ago. Let's just stay in the here and now, because we were doing really well when we did the here and now. And listen, I'm more than happy to.
We were doing really well. You were a nice guy until you started to ask me questions. I don't like when.
To review the issues that you have, but again, without preparation, without having the text in front of me, it's back foot time stuff. So because we're having a great conversation with regards to the other stuff, and I'm not saying it's an.
So you're framing the discussion. It's about. I thought this was a good. It's becoming a bad discussion. Yeah, we had a good discussion before. Yeah, I don't like this kind of discussion over here. No, because you're asking questions about my haystack book, right? Yeah, I can't find the needle,
An invalid criticism and so on. It's just that I can't go and review my book live in a debate. And if it is that important, just next time send it to me ahead of time and I'll have a chance to review it first.
Okay, I'll finish my point on it. I can see you want to move on. It is important that I stress this to people. When a syllogism begs the question, context is actually irrelevant. The reason being for that fact is that syllogisms work in a function. They try to prove something with their conclusion, and it follows from the premises. If it doesn't follow from the premises, or there's a logical fallacy committed, you do not have to read anything else, end off. because that is the way in which that logical fallacy comes across. When you watch the video, Stefan, I gave you the criticism, I gave you the time to be able to respond, and you simply just said, no, it isn't, and you moved on. And so I was hoping that when we got
I don't know what I said 2 years ago, man. I mean, that's a bit of an ambush, right? Let's deal with stuff that we can reason out in the here and now.
Mate, honestly, if me pointing out where you're begging the question is an ambush, like, come on, man, like, this is the conversation that we want to have, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You invited me on.
No, but I don't know what the context. This is really boring. Let's do this another time. And
let's just cut this short. If you pull out, you're focusing the book on certain statements that is foundational for the validity of what you're trying to propose or establish, and you say it's dependent on the context of the whole book. I mean, it's a piece of garbage book. Then it doesn't work. If you're pulling out specific statements, they have to be freaking clear and be able to stand alone in some logical scrutiny that can be established. And if the scrutiny or it's fallacious, this statement, it should just be wiped out and removed, right? If you're taking out some part of the book and making the reader focus on that, it's because it's important. And extra care should be made to secure that this statement is not fallacious and it's clear and understandable by the one reading it. And it shouldn't be dependent on some arbitrary context somewhere else in the book. So anybody listening to this or anybody who have read the book should immediately discard this book as a piece of haystack, right? It doesn't work. It has to be, it's so confusing, it's so foggy, it's so subjective, it's so based on weasel words and establishing odds where there might not be an odd and so on. It does not work.
And maybe you're completely valid, but there's...
Okay, we'll do it another time, if that's what you...
Yeah, there's I don't know what the context is, and I know that I've got a whole bunch of proofs for UPB, and I'm not just assuming that it's true and moving on. Okay, now let's get to... Now
let's get to me ambushing you and some videos you made a couple of weeks ago or a year ago or 2 years ago, which you have actually just freaking wiped him off after you invited him to your debate. You're going exactly against what you just said you wouldn't want him to do to you. What kind of ridiculous, pathetic loser philosophy are you, right? I mean, I'm going to stop this recording now, but I would like to add from a talk he did on ethics in the early days. Let me see if I can find it. I'm going to look it up. I don't mind that I think my listeners can deal with that. What was it called? The early days when he ran through introduction to ethics. Introduction to Intro to Philosophy, Ethics.
Dare I even say it's my opinion of philosophy as a whole, which is the question of ethics or morality. And I use the terms, it's such an essential topic going to get as we start to go through the question of ethics, but it's such an essential topic that I don't want to take any assumptions. I mean, this is obviously quite a stretch. There's going to be some assumptions. I assume that you speak English and so on, but I'm going to try and take as few assumptions as possible in the realm of trying to bring down the beast of objective ethics without faltering or completely blowing my own foot off. It may happen, but I'd like to sort of take my best shot at it. And in order to do that, I'll need a little bit of patience from you. Some of the stuff that I'm talking about may at times seem to be a little bit esoteric, but I would really like to not take things for granted when talking about ethics. Now, the reason that I feel so strongly about this, I'm not sort of just trying to make up things as far as the reason that I want to do this so carefully, is because if you kind of get ethics wrong, really bad things happen in the world. It's sort of my opinion. And if you sort of look at something like statism, fascism, communism, or whatever, these are ethical theories that kind of missed the mark, right? And when you miss the mark, you don't just sort of lose the arrow in the brush. You sometimes bring down the lives of 70, 80, 100, 150 million souls. And so I would really like to not make mistakes when it comes to ethics. I think that the proposition of ethical theories is kind of like the weapons of mass destruction of the philosophical world. And I think it's something you have to be really, really careful about when you put them forward. If you make mistakes, a lot of people tend to get killed, right? When you have bad ethical theories that justify certain kinds of principles, especially around deference to authority and deference to governments and deference to certain kinds of religious institutions, well, you tend to get some people killed. So without wanting to sound over dramatic, I do take the question of ethics unbelievably seriously. And I'll make a couple of jokes as we go forward because I don't want it to be oppressive. But just so you understand it, this is the most serious part of what it is that I'm trying to do. And it's the part, this is actually take two. I'm going to take down take one because it wasn't consistent with what it is that I wanted to get across. The message was the same. I just wasn't pleased with the way I put it across. But I really am going to try and get this right. And I'm sorry if it seems a little tedious at times, but trust me, in this particular minefield, the minefield of trying to define ethics, we don't want to get anything wrong because, as I mentioned before, it's about the worst thing that any thinker can do is to put forward a system of ethics that is not rigorous and well thought out and logical and empirical. And as we'll argue a little bit further down the road in the podcast series on ethics, actually explains some things in the real world, like the failures of communism, the material benefits arising from the Industrial Revolution, the reason that science stagnated under religion. There's things that kind of you want to explain. Why was Nazism so bad? What's wrong with the concentration camp? I think you kind of want to have ethical theories that explain and to some degree hopefully predict the big events in human society, but most importantly, along with the empirical evidence, you want to have conceptual rigor and logical steps. So that having been said, I'm going to try and go at a fair clip, but I'm going to have to take some pauses to go over stuff. I'm sorry if it gets a little teeth gritting. I apologize in advance, but we really don't want to misstep in this particular phase of our conversation. We really, really don't want to. And I've been working on this stuff over 20 years, and I think I've worked it out now to the point where I'm willing to go public. So trust me.
Maybe you should adhere to your own statement here and maybe take another 20 years to work out another system, because UPB does not work, period.